It was the summer of 1884, and the Wyoming plains stretched out like a vast, unforgiving sea of dust. The winds howled through the valleys, carrying the weight of secrets buried deep within the earth, secrets only the land seemed to know. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting harsh shadows over the desolate hills, and the sky, a cruel, endless blue, held no promise of rain. The land here was not for the faint-hearted. It was a place where survival meant more than just living. It meant enduring. The Branson Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of this rugged territory, its fences marking a claim on earth that seemed unwilling to be tamed. It was a world where a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his heart, but by the size of his cattle and the strength of his grip on the land. Here, power didn't speak. It whispered, low and dangerous, in the rustle of dry grass and the creak of a weathered fence. Jasper Branson had built his empire not with affection, but with raw ambition, a ruthless will, and the kind of silence that filled the room like an unspoken law. But this story isn't about Jasper Branson. No, it's about his son, Travis Branson, a man forged in the shadow of a legacy too heavy to escape, a legacy that had cast its long reach over him since birth. Raised on the belief that dreams had no place here and love was a weakness to be discarded, Travis had inherited more than just land. He had inherited a future already written for him, where questions and aspirations were luxuries he couldn't afford. The sound of boots echoed through the hallway as Travis walked into his father's study, his face set in a mask of calm, like a man who had come to expect the weight of every day. The room smelled of aged leather and stale tobacco, the very scent of old power. Jasper didn't even lift his eyes from the papers sprawled across his desk. His voice was flat, emotionless. "It's time, son." Travis stood there for a moment, not moving, his gaze hardening as he tried to steady the emotions that threatened to rise. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. His voice came out slow, deliberate. "Time for what?" Jasper slid a folded letter across the desk, its corners worn and its seal cracked. His voice, as cold as the barren landscape outside, didn't waver. "You're marrying Clara Hayes this Saturday." Travis blinked, not from surprise, but from the disbelief that surged through him. Clara Hayes? The one from the outlying ranch. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening around the arms. "I thought that family was on its last legs." Jasper didn't even glance up, his focus remaining fixed on the papers before him. "She still has her father's land, barely. And she's the last of her name. Marrying her makes sense, Travis. It's smart business." The words hit him like a slap. Travis clenched his fists, fighting the bitterness that bubbled up, but his voice stayed even, controlled. "So, I'm just a pawn in your plan then?" Only then did Jasper look at him. His eyes were cold, like the edge of a blade. "You don't marry for love, you marry for power. Just like I did." A deep sigh escaped Travis, his chest tightening as he turned and walked out of the study. The evening sun scorched the dry earth outside, its heat settling over him like a weight. The dust kicked up around his boots, swirling in the dry air. He felt it then, an unfamiliar, uncomfortable pressure on his chest. Clara Hayes. He remembered her from years ago. Quiet, observant, always lingering on the edges of the social circles, as if she was a shadow, never quite fully seen. But time had passed. Whispers had spread. They spoke of hardship, of battles fought and lost, of a family that had once been prosperous, now crumbling into dust. What had she become in those years? What would he find when they met again? The land was a constant here, unyielding and steady, but his mind was restless. And as the sun dipped lower, casting the landscape in a molten glow, Travis couldn't shake the nagging thought that perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage would be the beginning of something he didn't expect or couldn't control. And in the distance, Clara Hayes waited, somewhere beyond the horizon, a reminder of a past he thought he understood, but a future that felt uncertain. Beneath a sky smeared with the grayish dust of the Wyoming plains, the Branson Chapel stood, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of years, as if the structure itself were reluctant to bear witness to the events about to unfold within its walls. The air was thick with the dry scent of old wood and the weight of history. There were no grand displays, no ornate decorations to mark the occasion, just the stark reality of what was to come. A handful of ranch hands, a preacher who owed Jasper Branson a debt, and a few curious locals who had come either to bear witness to a historical moment, or perhaps to a scandal. The chapel, with its creaking pews and narrow windows, seemed as much a part of the land as the dust that swirled outside. The silence inside hung heavy, thick like the heat of the afternoon sun. And as the heavy wooden doors groaned open, Travis braced himself, his heart pounding, though his outward demeanor remained unchanged. He had expected a nervous flutter, perhaps an awkwardness from the woman who had been thrust into his life by duty. Yet, what he saw as Clara Hayes entered caught him completely off guard. Clara moved with a quiet, measured grace that seemed to contrast the stillness of the room. There were no frills, no extravagance in her appearance. Her gown was simple, dove-gray, a muted reflection of the stark surroundings. The veil she wore shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if it too sought to veil her from the world, yet in doing so, it only emphasized the strength of the woman beneath it. She carried herself not with the tentative hesitation of a bride about to embark on an uncertain future, but with a calm assurance that seemed as rooted to the earth as the land outside. Travis stood frozen, his gaze fixed on her, his mind whirling in a haze of confusion. How was it that the woman he was about to marry, a woman he had scarcely known, exuded such a presence? It was not the naive beauty of youth, nor the tremor of a heart unsure of its place. It was something far more powerful, something that commanded attention simply through her stillness, through the quiet strength she carried with her every step. As she reached the altar, the preacher's words were dry, familiar, almost mechanical, echoing in the dusty chapel like a ritual that had been performed countless times before. But when Clara spoke her vows, her voice rang out, soft, yet clear, unwavering in its simplicity. The words she spoke held no grand promises, no passionate declarations, but in that moment, Travis felt something stir deep inside him. It was not love, not yet, but something far more complex. When the time came for Travis to lift her veil, his fingers hesitated for just a heartbeat. He had expected a meek, quiet woman, someone who would quietly accept her place in his world, someone to fit into the mold of a marriage built on necessity. But as he gently pulled the veil back, revealing the face beneath, he was taken aback. She was not plain, not timid. Instead, Clara Hayes was a presence that radiated power, not through words, but through her quiet, unyielding composure. There was something about her that made him feel both unsettled and intrigued, something in the way she stood, unshaken, unbent, and deeply certain of who she was. Their vows, though spoken with little emotion, felt weighty in their simplicity. There was no room for love in the words exchanged, no space for the affection that so many believed a marriage should be built upon. Their union was founded not on passion or mutual desire, but on necessity, on the land that would be shared, on the survival of two families entwined by legacy rather than choice. And yet, as they stood there, side by side, the weight of their decision seemed to settle heavily on Travis's chest. It was a burden he had expected, a duty he had accepted without question. But as the evening shadows grew longer and the chapel's dim light shifted, a single thought surfaced, one that refused to be ignored. What if she wasn't who either of them thought she would be? Travis had prepared himself for a woman who was simply the last piece of a business arrangement, someone he would live alongside, but never truly know. But Clara Hayes. Clara was something else entirely. Something that stirred a part of him he thought had long been buried beneath the dust of duty and obligation. The question, now firmly lodged in his mind, gnawed at him relentlessly. What if she was far more than just a strategic marriage? What if, beneath the layers of necessity and expectation, something unexpected began to grow? Days passed, and life on the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. Cattle grazed, fences were mended, and everything moved on as it always had. But the silence between Travis and Clara had changed. It was no longer the cold distance of strangers. It was something different, more like two people quietly waiting for something to shift, something to change. One morning, before the first light of dawn, Clara was already sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes locked onto the ranch's financial ledger, scanning the numbers with an intensity that seemed to hold the weight of the world. She read with such focus, as though every figure, every line, carried the future on its shoulders. Her concentration seemed to make the whole morning still, and Travis, stepping in from the kitchen, paused at the sight of her completely absorbed in her task. He stood frozen for a moment, surprised to see her so deep in thought. This woman he had barely known, whom he had thought of as nothing more than part of a business arrangement, now fully immersed in the work, her sharp mind evident in the way she studied the pages. He lingered in the doorway, watching her, unsure of how to react. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, he spoke, his voice thick with confusion. "You're reading the books?" Travis asked, a little caught off guard. She looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with an unhurried calm. "You left them out," Clara replied matter-of-factly. "I figured if I'm going to live here, I should understand how this place runs before I try to change it." Travis sat down across from her, his eyes now studying her in a way he hadn't before, really looking at her for the first time. He didn't see just a woman to be owned, to be controlled. He saw a partner, someone who stood her ground in her own right. He furrowed his brow, unsure of what to say, but in that silence, something passed between them, an understanding neither of them expected. It wasn't love, but it wasn't indifference either. It was something new, something subtle, a connection formed not by words, but by shared silence. Both of them felt it, though neither acknowledged it outright. They didn't need to speak. Everything had already been said in the quiet exchange of glances. And in that moment, the space between them felt less like a wall and more like an open field, where something might just begin to grow. It wasn't long before the land that had once seemed so still, so enduring, erupted in chaos. A wildfire, sparked by a careless moment, began its ruthless march across the dry, brittle grass. The flames spread fast, driven by the wind that swept across the open range, leaping from one patch of brush to the next with a terrifying speed. It was Travis who noticed it first, a plume of dark smoke rising from the far edges of the ranch, a thick black cloud that darkened the sky. His heart raced as he took in the sight, the realization of what was unfolding beginning to dawn on him. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse and urged it into a gallop, the hooves pounding the earth beneath them, the fire's ominous roar growing louder with every passing second. But as he neared the source of the smoke, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, in the heart of the chaos, was Clara. She was already in the thick of it, moving with an almost eerie calm. She carried buckets of water with ease, her movements swift and purposeful, as if she had done this all her life. The fire roared around her, but she stood firm, her face set in determination, a fierce glint in her eyes that matched the fire she was trying to fight. "What are you doing?" Travis demanded, pulling his horse to a sudden stop, his voice tight with urgency. Clara glanced up at him, unfazed by the flames licking at the ground nearby. "Helping," she replied simply, as though it was the most natural thing in the world to face down a wildfire without a second thought. For a brief moment, Travis simply stared at her, struck by the sight of her standing there, unflinching in the face of such a massive, uncontrollable force. Her determination was almost otherworldly, and something about the way she moved, so assured and steady, made his chest tighten. Before he even realized what he was doing, he dismounted and grabbed a bucket of water. Together, they worked side by side, the heat of the flames scorching their skin, the smoke stinging their eyes, but they didn't stop. They moved in sync, their bodies working in tandem as they fought back the fire, each moment filled with a kind of quiet unity that Travis hadn't expected. The fire was a brutal adversary, but so were they. It seemed to push harder, stretch farther, but they fought back together, not speaking, just acting, their shared goal binding them. As the fire slowly began to subside, its fury beaten back by their collective effort, Travis and Clara stood side by side, their clothes soaked with water, their faces streaked with ash. Their breathing was heavy, but there was no pride, no triumph in the air, just exhaustion, and something else, something that felt heavier than the smoke hanging in the air. Travis wiped the sweat from his brow, panting as he caught his breath. "You ever fought fire before?" he asked, his voice rough from the heat and exertion. "No," Clara replied without hesitation, her eyes still sharp, focused. "But I've fought worse." For the first time, Travis really saw her, not just as the woman he had married, not as the partner in a duty-bound arrangement, but as someone who had fought battles of her own, someone who had survived far more than he had ever known. She was unbroken, standing tall even after everything they had just endured. There was a quiet strength in her that he hadn't fully recognized before, but now it hit him like a wave. She wasn't just standing her ground. She was owning it. "You didn't have to do all that," Travis said, his voice softer than he had intended, his words laced with a mixture of admiration and guilt. He hadn't expected her to step in so fiercely, so unflinchingly. He hadn't expected this. Clara's gaze met his, unflinching, unwavering, as she shook her head slightly, her voice steady, almost challenging. "Neither did you," she shot back, the corner of her mouth lifting in a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "But we did it anyway." And in that moment, Travis realized something had shifted. What had started as a marriage of necessity, of obligation, had evolved into something different. They were no longer just two people bound by circumstance. They were equals, standing side by side, not just fighting a fire, but fighting for something more, something unspoken but understood. And for the first time since they had married, Travis felt something new stir in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the flames. It was the beginning of something he hadn't expected, but now couldn't ignore. Days passed, and slowly stretched into weeks. The dust settled back into its familiar rhythm on the ranch. The cattle grazed lazily, the fences were mended, and life continued as it always had. Yet, something had subtly shifted between Travis and Clara. They no longer moved in the same quiet, distant world that had once separated them. The awkward, formal exchanges had faded, replaced with a silent understanding. They found themselves side by side, not because they had to be, but because in the quiet of their days, they had begun to rely on each other in ways neither expected. Mornings became a quiet routine. Before the first light even touched the horizon, Clara would already be in the kitchen, her movements fluid and purposeful. The scent of fresh bread or coffee would fill the space, a familiar warmth in the otherwise cold mornings. Travis would wander in, drawn by the sound of the stove's crackle or the soft scrape of utensils. They wouldn't need to say much, just a nod, a brief word exchanged as they moved through the motions of starting the day together. Sometimes, their hands would brush as they passed the same bowl, or Clara would hand him a steaming mug of coffee without a word. It was in those simple exchanges that something began to grow. In the afternoons, when the work in the fields was done, they'd sit on the porch or in the shade of an old tree, watching the sun dip lower into the sky. Clara would be quietly observant, her eyes scanning the land, taking in the small details, something that Travis, in his preoccupied rush, had never noticed. He found himself drawn to her quiet presence, the way she seemed so at peace with the world around her. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were measured, purposeful, as though she chose them with the care she gave every other task. Travis, for the first time, didn't feel irritated by the silence. Instead, he began to see her differently. The woman he had married out of necessity, who had seemed so far removed from his world, was now someone he could share the weight of the ranch with, someone whose strength and resilience matched his own. They weren't just two people bound by duty anymore. There was a quiet partnership forming between them, one born not from words or promises, but from shared experiences and the knowledge that, together, they could carry the load of this place. Even during the simple moments, sitting together at dinner after a long day's work, there was a new kind of comfort. They would eat in silence, the sounds of their forks scraping against the plates and the crackle of the fire in the hearth filling the air. There was no need for elaborate conversation, no forced small talk. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It felt natural, like the calm after a storm, when everything had settled into place. They didn't need to fill the quiet with anything else. It was enough just to be there, together. It wasn't love, not yet. But in those small, quiet moments, there was the undeniable sense that something was beginning to form between them. It wasn't a grand, passionate kind of love, but something far more steady, more enduring. A connection that had grown from mutual respect, shared hardship, and the recognition that they were stronger together than apart. It was a slow-burning fire, one that could, over time, turn into something more, something real. The night in Wyoming was still, and the stars hung high in the velvet sky, twinkling like tiny promises. The air was crisp, carrying with it the quiet of the vast, open space. Travis and Clara sat side by side on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. The world around them seemed far away, as if it, too, had paused for a moment to let them simply be. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of love, no promises that would fill the silence. Just the unspoken understanding that, somehow, after all the time spent together, they had chosen each other, not because they had to, but because they truly wanted to. The last few months had brought with them more than just the usual rhythm of life on the ranch. They had shared moments of struggle, moments of quiet companionship, and moments of real growth. Together, they had faced challenges, facing down fires, both literal and metaphorical. It wasn't the kind of love you read about in fairy tales, not the kind that bursts into flame instantly. It was more like the steady, quiet burn of a hearth fire, warmth that builds over time, that grows stronger with every log added to the flames. And as they sat there, in the silence of the Wyoming night, it was clear to them both. This was just the beginning. Maybe I should have seen it sooner, Travis murmured, his voice soft in the still night air, as he gazed at the stars. But I'm glad I see it now. Clara turned her head to look at him, her expression calm, steady, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Sometimes, all it takes is time, she replied, her voice full of quiet wisdom, as though she had always known this moment would come. And there, in the cool embrace of the evening, they sat together, side by side, watching the stars twinkle above them. It was a moment of clarity, a moment that reminded them both that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or sweeping gestures. Sometimes, it's built in the quiet spaces between words, in the slow steps taken together, in the shared moments of simply being there for each other. They both understood that this was the start of something that would last a lifetime, not because it had been rushed, but because it had been earned through patience, understanding, and the quiet recognition that they were enough for each other. Love, like a fire, doesn't always ignite with a sudden blaze. It often begins with the smallest of sparks, taking time to grow, to burn brightly, and to withstand the winds that try to put it out. It's in these quiet moments, the slow steps, the little gestures, that love is nurtured. It's not the perfect story from the beginning, but one that unfolds over time, through challenges, through sacrifices, and through the growth of both individuals as they learn to accept each other's flaws and imperfections. It's built not on grand moments, but on simple, sincere ones, those moments that form the foundation of a relationship that endures. Life itself is much the same. We all carry our stories, our wounds, our beliefs, our dreams unfulfilled. But when we learn to accept ourselves, when we learn to embrace the challenges life brings our way, we begin to find strength within. The peace of the heart comes not from avoiding struggles, but from learning how to face them with patience, understanding, and the courage to move forward. The story of Travis and Clara is not just about two people falling in love. It's about two people learning to love, learning to accept each other, and building something meaningful together. Their journey didn't begin with fireworks or grand moments. It started with small, simple moments, but it's in those moments that they found something lasting, something real. And that, they both knew, was the true meaning of love.